In the early 18th century, Protestant missionaries navigated perilous Atlantic crossings in order to reach the colonial Caribbean. Upon arrival, the Moravian Church achieved a specific historical distinction. They became the first Protestant group to evangelize enslaved Africans, recognizing their common humanity and welcoming them into a Christian community. Despite this recognition, the Church's active participation in colonial slavery lasted 106 years. The Moravians purchased plantations, constructed sugar mills, and legally owned enslaved people as recorded property. This timeline tracks the simultaneous growth of the mission and the institution. The spiritual mission initiated in 1732, while institutional slavery ran parallel for over a century. This was not a gradual economic drift, but a system maintained through deliberate theology. To understand how colonial Christianity functioned in practice, we have to examine the religious framework that separated spiritual salvation from physical liberation. This map of the Virgin Islands outlines the Danish West Indies in the 1730s, the geographical and political environment where the Moravians established their early missions. Two foundational primary sources reveal their theological logic. The first is a 1738 letter by August Spangenberg, written shortly before the Moravians purchased their first plantation and enslaved laborers. The second is Count Zinzendorf's farewell address, delivered directly to the enslaved congregation in St. Thomas in 1739. Both texts detail a concept known as theological dualism, the philosophical mechanism used to reconcile spiritual equality with physical bondage. These documents contain the theological blueprint that used Christian doctrine to enforce the colonial status quo. Spangenberg's 1738 letter proves that the Church's leadership had a clear understanding of the brutality inherent in the Danish West Indies. Looking at this 18th century engraving of the plantation fields, we can ground Spangenberg's written observations. He describes the slavery there as so inhuman that it makes one's hair stand on end. He documents how enslaved people are driven to work in the heat with scourges and whips. He notes the forced separation of enslaved husbands and wives when an owner dies, and the mandate that women be given to reproduce the workforce. He explicitly compares their treatment to the oxen and donkeys of the Old Testament. Spangenberg points out that biblical livestock were granted a day of rest, whereas enslaved Africans farmed their own food on Sundays simply to survive the week. Spangenberg was aware of the cruelty of the colonial machine, which makes his theological conclusions regarding emancipation calculated. In the same letter, Spangenberg deliberates on a proposal from fellow missionary Friedrich Martin. Martin suggested buying the freedom of enslaved individuals who converted and showed an aptitude for ministry. This logic tree illustrates Spangenberg's rejection of that proposal. He feared that linking baptism to freedom would incentivize false conversions. If enslaved people know adopting the Christian religion leads to legal freedom, the Church risks being flooded with individuals seeking relief from their physical misery rather than seeking spiritual salvation. For Spangenberg, maintaining the physical suffering of slavery acts as a quality control mechanism. It ensures the spiritual purity of the congregation. The Moravians opposed emancipation because they viewed physical freedom as a threat to genuine Christian conversion. In 1739, Count Zinzendorf stood before the enslaved Moravian converts in St. Thomas to deliver his farewell address, cementing this theology into church policy. We can map Zinzendorf's pedological dualism on this split-screen graphic. He commands his audience by separating the eternal soul from the mortal body. In the top half, Zinzendorf preaches that Jesus' blood washes the soul of its sins. In this spiritual realm, all humans are granted equality and eternal life. In the bottom half, he relies on the Pauline epistles to assert that the physical body belongs to an earthly hierarchy. He tells them that God created kings, masters, servants, and slaves, and that every individual must remain in the physical state where God placed them. He then invokes the curse of Ham from the book of Genesis to tell his enslaved audience that God punished their specific lineage to be serfs and slaves. According to Zinzendorf's doctrine, Christian conversion does not grant physical freedom. Instead, it cures the enslaved of laziness and faithlessness, creating a more compliant workforce for the colonial planters. We can see how this theology functioned in practice by looking at the year 1747. By this point, the Moravians owned the Neunhern-Newt plantation and its enslaved laborers, integrating themselves into the colonial economy. This 18th century engraving shows the Moravian headquarters in Bethlehem. From this institutional center, church leadership held jurisdiction over the mission in the Danish West Indies. In 1747, Bethlehem issued a reprimand to the Caribbean missionaries. The leaders in Pennsylvania condemned the brothers in St. Croix for building sugar boiling houses. Bethlehem's reprimand focused on the pursuit of earthly profit. The ownership of human beings was an accepted premise. The leadership viewed the labor-intensive production of sugar as a worldly distraction that pulled the missionaries away from their primary objective, saving the souls of the enslaved. The institutional conflicts within the church were about maintaining focus on the spiritual mission. The physical enslavement of Africans was a settled theological premise. The Moravian recognition of African humanity was compartmentalized to the spiritual realm. This soul-body dualism locked into geographic reality, insulating the church from abolitionist pressures. By defining hierarchies as divinely ordained, they built the foundation for 106 years of slaveholding. This doctrine allowed missionaries to view themselves as saviors of souls while simultaneously operating as masters of bodies. Modern historiography often attempts to categorize 18th century actors cleanly, labeling them as either benevolent figures or maliciously complicit villains. The Moravian mission demonstrates how conservative theological frameworks were used to build early Afro-Christianity. The promise of spiritual equality created a real community among the enslaved. Yet this exact same theology was simultaneously used to powerfully reinforce the massive economic machinery of the Atlantic world. In the context of the Danish West Indies, spiritual equality became the mechanism used to maintain physical bondage. Recognizing human divinity was not always the first step toward granting human freedom.